Please leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more interesting stories. Let's get into the story. The streets of Lagos were alive with their usual chaos, blaring horns, impatient drivers, and the suffocating heat that clung to the air. Deborah clutched her worn handbag, anxiety pressing heavily on her chest as she glanced at the time on her cracked phone screen. She had woken up before dawn, praying earnestly for this day to be her breakthrough. The job interview at Stephen Holdings was her one shot at escaping the crushing poverty that had plagued her life. But the infamous Lagos traffic had other plans. As she boarded a bus heading towards Victoria Island, her heart pounded. The minutes slipped away mercilessly as the vehicles around her crawled at a snail's pace. Just when she thought she could still make it, the unthinkable happened. The bus broke down in the middle of the road. Passengers groaned in frustration, but for Deborah, it was a nightmare unfolding before her eyes. Desperation took hold of her as she grabbed her bag and sprinted towards another bus, ignoring the sweat drenching her clothes. By the time she arrived at Stephen Holdings, she was nearly 2 hours late. Inside the grand glass building, an air of professionalism surrounded the candidates awaiting their turn. Men in well-pressed suits and women dressed in elegant corporate attire sat with composed expressions, barely sparing a glance at the exhausted young woman who stumbled in, panting. Deborah's once neatly ironed blouse was damp, her skirt slightly crumpled from all the running. As she walked into the hallway leading to the interview room, she whispered a silent prayer. She had worked tirelessly for this opportunity, yet she was fully aware that tardiness could cost her everything. Summoning the last bit of her courage, she approached the receptionist. "Please, I'm here for the interview," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The lady at the desk gave her a quick glance before shaking her head. "The CEO has already begun the interviews. I doubt he'll see you now." Deborah's stomach twisted in knots. She had come all this way, only to be dismissed at the door. She had to try. With renewed determination, she rushed past the receptionist and towards the interview hall, ignoring the calls behind her. The heavy wooden doors of the interview room flung open as Deborah barged in, gasping for breath. The room fell silent, all eyes locking onto her disheveled figure. Sitting at the head of the long conference table was Joshua Stephen, the powerful CEO of Stephen Holdings. His piercing gaze landed on her, cold and unreadable. Deborah could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears as she struggled to steady her breath. "Young lady, you're not allowed in here," Joshua's deep voice broke the silence, laced with irritation. Murmurs spread across the room, as the other candidates watched the spectacle unfold. Deborah knew she had only seconds to explain before she was escorted out. "Sir, please," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "The traffic was unbearable, and the bus I took broke down. I've been running just to get here." But Joshua was not a man moved by excuses. His face remained indifferent as he gestured towards the exit. "Rules are rules. If you can't manage your time properly, then you don't deserve to work here." Deborah's heart shattered at his cold dismissal. She had lost her only chance. The heavy weight of rejection crushed Deborah's spirit as she stood frozen in the middle of the room, her eyes pleading for another chance. But Joshua's face remained unreadable, his gaze sharp and unwavering. The air in the room was thick with tension as the other candidates stole glances at her, some in amusement, others in pity. Christabel, the CEO's efficient and no-nonsense secretary, took a step forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Mr. Stephen has made his decision," she said firmly. "Please leave." Deborah's throat tightened as she looked around, desperately hoping for an ounce of sympathy. But none came. Her limbs felt numb as she turned away, each step heavier than the last. The moment she stepped out of the conference room, tears welled up in her eyes. She had fought so hard to get here, and now, in a matter of seconds, all her dreams had slipped through her fingers. As she walked out of the imposing glass building, the heat of the afternoon sun felt unbearable against her skin. The streets bustled with activity, but Deborah felt disconnected from it all. Her mother's frail voice echoed in her head, reminding her of the hospital bills piling up, the empty cupboards at home, and the weight of responsibility she carried alone. She had promised her mother she would secure this job, that their suffering would finally end. But now, what was she going to tell her? Would her mother be able to bear another disappointment? Her vision blurred as she wiped the sweat and tears from her face, frustration boiling inside her. Why did life have to be so cruel? Why did people like Joshua Stephen, who had everything, not understand the struggles of the poor? If only he had listened, just for a moment. Deborah's steps slowed as she approached a small roadside shop. She had spent her last transport fare getting to the company, and now she had no idea how she would get home. She sat on a nearby bench, burying her face in her hands. She needed to think. Maybe she could find another job opening, or perhaps beg for another chance tomorrow. But deep down, she knew Joshua Stephen was not the type to change his mind. As she sat lost in thought, she didn't realize that fate had other plans. Her day was about to take an even more unexpected turn. With her mind clouded by hopelessness, Deborah barely paid attention to where she was walking. Her feet moved on their own, carrying her down the busy streets of Lagos. She was consumed by her thoughts, replaying the painful moment Joshua had dismissed her. If only she had woken up earlier, if only she had taken another route, maybe, just maybe, she would have been inside that office answering questions instead of walking aimlessly like a lost soul. She didn't see the black, sleek car speeding towards her until it was too late. A sharp honk blared through the air, followed by the deafening screech of tires. People around gasped in horror as the impact sent Deborah crashing to the ground. Joshua sat frozen in the driver's seat, his heart slamming against his chest. For the first time in years, fear gripped him in a way he couldn't ignore. He hadn't even been driving that fast. How had this happened? The moment he stepped out of his car, his worst fear was confirmed. It was her. The same girl from the interview. She lay motionless, her face pale, her clothes dirtied by the street. A wave of panic surged through him as he knelt beside her, his hands hovering over her frail body. His entire life, he had been a man of control, a man who never let emotions dictate his actions. But seeing her like this, knowing that he was responsible, it shook him to his core. "Miss?" he called out, his voice strained. "Can you hear me?" When she didn't respond, something inside him snapped. He needed to act fast. Ignoring the growing crowd, Joshua scooped Deborah into his arms and carried her to his car. Christabel, who had been in the passenger seat, stared in shock. "Sir, should we call an ambulance?" she asked hesitantly. Joshua's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he sped towards the nearest hospital. "No. We're taking her there ourselves." His reputation, his carefully constructed life, none of it mattered right now. The only thing that mattered was making sure she lived. Joshua paced the hospital corridor, his usually composed demeanor shaken. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air, and the steady hum of hospital activity buzzed around him. But all he could focus on was the unconscious woman lying in the emergency room. Deborah's fragile form looked even smaller against the white hospital bed. The moment he had carried her into the hospital, the nurses had rushed her inside, and now, he was left waiting, feeling a kind of helplessness he had never experienced before. He was a man used to making things happen with a snap of his fingers, but here, he had no control over the situation. His mind raced with thoughts. What if she didn't make it? What if he had just ruined a young woman's life? His chest tightened at the thought. Christabel, who had accompanied him, watched him with wide eyes. In all the years she had worked for Joshua, she had never seen him so unsettled. "Sir, are you sure you don't want me to handle this? We could have one of our legal teams take care of everything," she suggested carefully. But Joshua shook his head. "No. I need to see this through," he said, his voice firm. He didn't know why he felt so responsible for Deborah, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had to ensure she was okay. Minutes turned into hours, and when the doctor finally emerged, Joshua's heart pounded. "She's stable," the doctor announced, adjusting his glasses. "She suffered some minor bruises and a mild concussion, but she'll recover with rest." Relief washed over Joshua, but it was accompanied by something unexpected: guilt. Stepping into the hospital room, he found Deborah awake, staring at the ceiling with tired eyes. When she saw him, her body tensed. "You," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Why are you here?" Joshua exhaled, feeling something stir inside him at the raw emotion in her voice. "I hit you with my car," he admitted, his voice softer than usual. "I had to make sure you were okay." Deborah let out a bitter chuckle. "First, you take away my opportunity, and now, you almost take my life. What do I owe this generosity?" Her words stung in a way Joshua didn't expect. For the first time in years, he had no sharp response, no clever retort. Instead, he simply said, "I want to help." Joshua had never been the kind of man who felt pity, nor did he offer help unless there was a business advantage. But as he sat beside Deborah's hospital bed, listening to her speak about her struggles, something in him shifted. She wasn't just another desperate job seeker, she was a fighter. She spoke about her sick mother, the sleepless nights working multiple jobs, and the crushing weight of poverty. He had been so quick to dismiss her before, assuming she was like everyone else, easily replaceable. But now, he realized she was different. Her resilience, her determination despite the obstacles, made him admire her. He hated admitting it, but she had something most people in his wealthy circle lacked: real strength. Deborah, however, didn't want his sympathy. She had spent her entire life fighting against people looking down on her, and she wasn't about to become someone's charity case. "I don't need your help," she said stubbornly, struggling to sit up. But the moment she tried, pain shot through her side, and she winced. Joshua sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're in no position to refuse help right now," he said. "Your medical bills have been taken care of. The least you can do is accept that." Deborah's pride burned, but she knew she couldn't argue. The truth was, she had nothing. Not even enough money to pay for a hospital meal. Still, the idea of owing this man something made her uneasy. Joshua leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "The company's positions are filled," he admitted. "But I have another offer. Work for me as my personal assistant." Deborah's eyes widened. "At your home?" she asked suspiciously. Joshua nodded. "You'll handle my schedules, emails, and meetings. It's a job, and it pays well." Deborah hesitated. A job in his home? The idea was intimidating. But then she thought about her mother, about the bills waiting for her at home. Swallowing her pride, she nodded slowly. "I'll take it," Joshua exhaled, relieved for reasons he couldn't explain. He had a feeling hiring her would change everything. Deborah sat silently in the passenger seat of Joshua's luxurious black car, her fingers nervously clutching the fabric of her worn dress. The journey from the hospital to Joshua's home felt surreal. Only a day ago, she had been struggling to land a simple office job, and now, she was heading to the mansion of one of the richest men in Lagos. She stole a glance at Joshua, who sat beside her, his attention fixed on his phone as he typed swiftly. He exuded power and confidence, yet she still couldn't figure him out. Why had he offered her this job? Was it guilt? Pity? Or something else entirely? She had no choice but to accept it, but a part of her feared what working in his home would be like. Would he treat her the same way he had at the interview? Would she be just another replaceable employee in his eyes? When the car finally pulled into the driveway of Joshua's estate, Deborah's breath hitched. The mansion before her was massive, standing tall with its grand white walls and golden accents. The beautifully manicured gardens and the glistening fountain at the entrance made it look like something out of a dream. As they stepped out of the car, a group of uniformed staff immediately greeted Joshua, their movements precise and respectful. Deborah felt out of place among such wealth. She had never stepped foot in a place this extravagant before. "Come with me," Joshua said, his voice steady as he led her inside. The interior was just as breathtaking: high ceilings, sparkling chandeliers, and furniture that looked like it belonged in a royal palace. Deborah swallowed hard, feeling small in the vast space. Christabel, who had accompanied them, handed Deborah a neatly printed contract. "Read through it and sign," she said in her usual professional tone. Deborah took the papers hesitantly, scanning the terms. The pay was beyond anything she had ever earned in her life, and the job itself seemed straightforward: managing Joshua's schedules, responding to emails, and ensuring his daily affairs ran smoothly. But despite the clear job description, she knew this arrangement was anything but ordinary. She glanced up at Joshua, who was now watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher. Taking a deep breath, she signed the contract. Her life had just taken a turn she never expected. Deborah's first day as Joshua's personal assistant was anything but easy. She quickly realized that working for a billionaire was unlike any job she had ever had before. Joshua was a man of precision. Every second of his day was accounted for, and he had no patience for mistakes. She found herself running from one room to another, ensuring his schedules were followed to the letter. Meetings, phone calls, business reports, everything had to be perfectly aligned. It didn't help that Joshua rarely showed emotion, making it impossible to tell whether she was doing well or failing miserably. He barely acknowledged her presence, except when giving direct instructions, and even then, his words were curt. By the second day, Deborah was exhausted. She had woken up before dawn to ensure Joshua's breakfast was set, only to find out he had already left for an early meeting. Then, she had spent the entire afternoon organizing his office, only for him to barely glance at her work before moving on. The staff in the mansion, though polite, maintained a strict professional distance. She felt like an outsider in a world she didn't belong to. But Deborah refused to let frustration win. She needed this job, and she would prove that she was more than just a poor girl he had hired out of pity. She started paying closer attention to Joshua's habits, learning his preferences and anticipating his needs before he voiced them. One evening, as she placed a neatly organized report on his desk, Joshua finally paused, his sharp gaze landing on her. "You learn quickly," he remarked, his voice neutral. It was the closest thing to a compliment she had received from him. Deborah nodded, meeting his gaze with quiet determination. "I have to," she said simply. For the first time, something flickered in Joshua's expression, something close to curiosity. He had expected her to struggle, maybe even quit, but she was proving to be far more resilient than he had assumed. He didn't know why, but he found himself watching her a little more closely. A week passed, and though Deborah had begun to adapt to her role, she still found Joshua unpredictable. He wasn't unnecessarily cruel, but he was distant, almost as if he had built an invisible wall around himself. She often wondered what kind of man he was beneath the cold, business-like exterior. One evening, as she worked on organizing some business files in his home office, she noticed Joshua sitting by the window, lost in thought. The setting sun cast a golden hue over his features, making him look almost lonely. It was a rare moment of vulnerability, and Deborah hesitated before speaking. "Do you ever take breaks?" she asked cautiously. Joshua turned his head slightly, surprised by her question. "I don't have time for breaks," he replied, his voice calm but firm. Deborah sighed, setting down a folder. "You should. Even the most powerful people need to breathe sometimes." There was a brief silence before Joshua let out a small chuckle, low and unexpected. "And what would you suggest? A vacation?" His tone was almost amused. Deborah smiled slightly. "Maybe not a vacation, but something that reminds you there's life outside work." Joshua studied her for a moment before shaking his head. "You're an interesting one, Deborah." That night, as she walked to her room in the staff quarters, she couldn't help but feel that something had shifted. It was subtle, but it was there, a crack in the icy demeanor of the billionaire CEO. And for the first time, she wondered if there was more to Joshua Stephen than the cold businessman the world saw. One evening, during a particularly stressful day at work, Joshua returned home looking unusually drained. Deborah had never seen him like this. His usually composed expression was etched with frustration, his tie loosened as if he had barely made it through the day. He walked straight past her without a word and headed to the study. Something about the way his shoulders sagged told her that today had been different. Against her better judgment, she followed him. "Sir," she called softly, stepping into the room. Joshua didn't look up. "Not now, Deborah." But instead of leaving, she walked over and set a cup of coffee on his desk. "You look like you need this," she said gently. Joshua finally lifted his gaze, staring at the steaming cup before exhaling. "You don't have to do this," he muttered, though he reached for the cup anyway. Deborah shrugged. "I know. But I wanted to." Silence stretched between them before Joshua finally spoke. "It's been a long day." His voice lacked its usual sharpness. For once, he sounded human. Deborah sat down across from him, not as his employee, but as someone willing to listen. And that night, for the first time, Joshua opened up, not about business, but about himself. Days turned into weeks, and the dynamic between Deborah and Joshua subtly shifted. Though he was still the powerful, unreadable CEO, there were moments, small, fleeting moments, where he let his guard down around her. He no longer treated her like just another employee. Instead, he found himself looking forward to their quiet conversations, their stolen moments of normalcy in his otherwise structured world. Deborah, too, found herself drawn to him in ways she didn't expect. He was still a mystery, but there was something beneath the cold exterior, something real. One evening, as they walked through the mansion's grand hallway, Joshua paused. "Deborah," he said, his voice softer than usual. "You've surprised me." She tilted her head, puzzled. "Is that a good thing?" A small smirk played at his lips. "I haven't decided yet." And as he walked away, Deborah realized that whatever was happening between them, whatever this unspoken connection was only just beginning. Joshua sat alone in his study, staring at the glass of whiskey in his hand. The sight of Deborah, her unwavering determination, and her resilience had started to stir something inside him, something he hadn't felt in decades. It made him uncomfortable. He had spent the last 20 years avoiding love, choosing instead to pour himself into his business, building an empire that stood untouchable. But why? His mind drifted back to a time when he was just a young man, ambitious and full of dreams. He had once been in love. Deeply. Madly. But she had betrayed him in a way that left a scar he never allowed to heal. She had chosen wealth over him, and he had vowed never to let himself be vulnerable again. Shaking his head, he forced himself back to the present. He had told himself for years that love was nothing but a weakness, a distraction that led only to pain. And yet, here he was, unable to stop himself from watching Deborah, noticing the way she bit her lip when she was nervous, the quiet determination in her eyes when she worked tirelessly to meet his expectations. He had tried to convince himself that his interest in her was merely professional, but deep down, he knew better. He was drawn to her. But could he risk reopening old wounds for a woman who had stumbled into his life by accident? As the night stretched on, Joshua found himself trapped in an internal battle. The rational part of him warned that Deborah was different, that she wasn't after his money or power. But the scars of the past whispered otherwise. Love had once cost him everything. He couldn't afford to make that mistake again. But then, why was it so hard to keep his distance from her? Deborah had always been careful with her emotions. Life had taught her that expecting too much only led to disappointment. But with each passing day, she found herself drawn to Joshua in ways she couldn't explain. He was strict, sometimes unbearably so, yet there were moments when she caught glimpses of something else, something softer beneath his cold exterior. It was in the way his eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking, The subtle acts of care he showed without realizing it. Like the time he noticed she skipped lunch and had a meal quietly sent to her room. Or the way he made sure she had everything she needed for her mother's hospital bills, even without asking. She tried to push the feelings away. Falling for a man like Joshua Stephen was dangerous. He was rich, powerful, and emotionally unavailable. And she? She was just a poor girl trying to survive. What future could they possibly have together? Still, no matter how much she tried to remind herself of the impossible gap between them, her heart refused to listen. Every moment they shared only made her feelings stronger. One afternoon, as she walked into his office with some documents, she found him staring out the window, deep in thought. He looked different, almost lost. "Are you okay?" she asked before she could stop herself. He turned to her, something unreadable in his eyes. "You ask too many questions," he said, but his voice lacked its usual sharpness. Deborah smiled softly. "Maybe because I care." The words left her lips before she could stop them, and Joshua's expression shifted. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken emotions. And in that moment, Deborah knew, there was no denying it anymore. She had fallen for him. Joshua wasn't a man prone to emotions, but when he saw Deborah laughing with one of the new recruits in the office, something inside him twisted. He didn't like it. It was irrational, even childish, but the sight of her smiling so freely with another man made his jaw tighten. Why did it bother him? He had no right to feel this way. Deborah was his employee, nothing more. And yet, he found himself keeping an eye on her interactions, growing irritated when other men got too close. The realization hit him like a truck: he was jealous. The thought alone frustrated him. He was a man of control, yet here he was, struggling with emotions he had buried for years. That night, as Deborah handed him some files, he spoke without thinking. "That new recruit, what's his name?" She blinked, confused. "You mean Daniel?" Joshua nodded, trying to sound casual. "You seem to enjoy his company." Deborah frowned slightly. "He's just a friend." But Joshua didn't miss the way she looked surprised by his question. Did she sense his jealousy? He dismissed her quickly, feeling foolish. But as she walked away, he couldn't ignore the way his heart pounded. He was losing control, and it scared him more than anything. One evening, Deborah received a devastating call from the hospital. Her mother's condition had worsened. Panic gripped her as she rushed to the hospital, her mind racing with worry. When she arrived, the doctor explained that without immediate treatment, her mother might not survive. Deborah felt helpless. She didn't have the money for the expensive procedure, and no bank would grant her a loan with her financial situation. Joshua noticed her absence the next morning and immediately sensed something was wrong. When she finally returned, her face was pale, and her usual spark was gone. "What happened?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. At first, Deborah hesitated, but when he insisted, she broke down, telling him everything. Without a second thought, Joshua made a call, ensuring that her mother received the best medical care. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, tears in her eyes. But Joshua simply looked at her. "I want to." Deborah couldn't believe it. He was helping her, not as a boss, but as someone who truly cared. And that realization made her heart ache even more. A few days later, after her mother's successful surgery, Deborah returned to work, overwhelmed with gratitude. That evening, as she walked into her room, she found a small package waiting for her. Inside was a beautiful, delicate bracelet with her initials engraved on it. There was no note, but she knew who it was from. The next day, she hesitantly approached Joshua. "Thank you for everything," she said softly. He didn't look up from his work but smirked slightly. "You're welcome." It was such a simple exchange, but for Deborah, it meant everything. Little did she know, Joshua had spent an entire night debating whether or not to give her that gift. It wasn't just a bracelet, it was a sign that, Whether he liked it or not, she had become important to him. The night was unusually quiet in Joshua's mansion. Deborah had finished her work for the day and was about to head to bed when she saw Joshua sitting alone in the garden. He looked different, less like the powerful CEO and more like a man lost in thought. She hesitated for a moment before gathering her courage and approaching him. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly. Joshua looked up, startled, before sighing. "Something like that." There was a rare vulnerability in his voice, one Deborah had never heard before. For the first time, Joshua opened up about his past. He spoke about the woman who had betrayed him, how he had shut himself off from love, and how his business had become his only refuge. Deborah listened intently, feeling a deep sadness for the man who had built walls so high that even he seemed trapped inside them. "Not everyone will hurt you," she said after a long pause. "Some people may stay." Her words lingered in the air between them, and Joshua found himself staring at her, his heart pounding. How had she become so important to him? How had she managed to break through his defenses? As the night deepened, neither of them moved. The silence was comforting, filled with unsaid emotions. Joshua realized then that Deborah was different. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't after his wealth or his power. She was simply her. And that terrified him. Because for the first time in 20 years, he wanted to take a risk. A risk on love. The next morning, the mansion staff couldn't ignore the change between Joshua and Deborah. The way his eyes lingered on her, the small but noticeable moments of care, it was enough for whispers to start spreading. Even at the office, his employees noticed. Christabel, his secretary, was the first to pick up on it. She had worked with Joshua for years and had never seen him act this way. And she didn't like it. "Have you noticed how close they've gotten?" one of the employees whispered in the break room. "It's strange, right? Mr. Stephen never pays attention to women." The rumors quickly spread, and soon, everyone was talking about Deborah, the poor girl who had somehow captured the attention of the cold billionaire. Some admired her, others envied her, and a few wanted to see her fail. Deborah, however, was unaware of the growing speculation. She was too focused on her work and the strange feelings she was developing for Joshua. But one afternoon, as she walked past a group of employees, she heard them whispering. "She's probably using him," one sneered. "Or maybe he just feels sorry for her." The words stung, but before Deborah could react, Joshua appeared. His sharp gaze silenced the room. "If any of you have time to gossip, then you have time to work overtime," he said coldly. The employees scattered immediately. Joshua turned to Deborah, his expression softening. "Ignore them," he said simply. But Deborah couldn't ignore them. Because deep down, she feared they might be right. Joshua had always been a man of control, but lately, he felt like he was losing his grip. No matter how much he tried to fight it, his feelings for Deborah only grew stronger. It was getting harder to hide, harder to deny. And when he saw her laughing with Daniel, the new recruit, something inside him snapped. That evening, as Deborah was about to leave the office, Joshua called her into his office. "Close the door," he ordered. His voice was calm, but his eyes were stormy. Deborah hesitated before stepping inside. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked cautiously. Joshua exhaled, rubbing his temples. He wasn't good at this, expressing emotions, letting people in. But for Deborah, he was willing to try. "I don't like seeing you with him," he finally admitted. "With Daniel?" Deborah blinked, taken aback. "Why?" she asked, her heart racing. Joshua looked at her for a long moment before sighing. "Because I don't want anyone else near you," he confessed. "I don't understand it, and I don't know how to handle it, but I care about you, Deborah. More than I should." Deborah's breath caught in her throat. She had never expected him to say those words, never imagined that the cold, distant man she had met weeks ago would stand before her, vulnerable and unsure. Joshua, she started, but he shook his head. You don't have to say anything, he said quickly. Just don't walk away. His voice was almost a plea. And in that moment, Deborah knew. No matter how complicated this was, no matter how many obstacles lay ahead, she wasn't going anywhere. After Joshua's confession, things changed between them. He was still the same demanding boss, still strict and intimidating, but there was something different now, something softer. One evening, just as Deborah was finishing her work, Joshua did something unexpected. Have dinner with me, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Deborah's eyes widened. Are you asking me out? She asked hesitantly. Joshua smirked. You could say that. Dinner with Joshua Stephen wasn't just any dinner. He took her to the most luxurious restaurant in Lagos, a place she had only ever seen in magazines. The moment they walked in, all eyes were on them. The rich and powerful whispered amongst themselves, trying to figure out who she was. But Joshua ignored them, his attention solely on Deborah. Are you uncomfortable? He asked, noticing her nervousness. Deborah shook her head. No, just surprised. She had never been treated like this before, never been made to feel so special. As the night went on, they talked, not as boss and employee, but as two people discovering something new. Joshua found himself laughing, truly laughing, for the first time in years. And Deborah? She realized that beneath his cold exterior was a man who had simply been afraid to love. As they left the restaurant, Joshua did something even more unexpected. He reached for her hand. And just like that, the lines between them blurred even more. After their first date, Joshua could no longer pretend. He was falling for Deborah, deeply, uncontrollably. It scared him, but at the same time, he couldn't stop himself. He started looking for reasons to be near her, to talk to her, to hear her laugh. It was unfamiliar territory, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure what to do. Deborah, on the other hand, was struggling with her own emotions. She had spent her entire life believing that love was for people who had the luxury of time and wealth. But Joshua was proving her wrong. He was showing her that love could be unexpected, that it could find you even when you least expected it. But still, doubts lingered. What if she was just a passing phase for him? What if he woke up one day and decided she wasn't worth it? One evening, as they sat together in his study, Joshua turned to her. What are you thinking? He asked. Deborah hesitated before answering, that this feels too good to be true. Joshua's expression darkened. I don't do things halfway, Deborah. If I'm in this, I'm all in. His words sent a shiver through her. And in that moment, she knew, he wasn't just playing with her. This was real. Deborah had started to settle into her new reality, growing more comfortable with her role and her relationship with Joshua. But just as things seemed to be going smoothly, a new storm appeared in the form of Richard Lawson, a wealthy businessman who had his eyes set on her. Richard was everything the elite admired, charming, influential, and born into privilege. The moment he met Deborah at a charity gala, he was intrigued. Unlike the superficial women he was used to, she had an authenticity that made her stand out. He wasted no time making his interest known, showering her with compliments and invitations to exclusive events. Joshua, however, saw through Richard immediately. He knew his type, men who viewed women as conquests rather than partners. And the way Richard looked at Deborah sent a surge of irritation through him. When Richard invited her to lunch, Joshua's patience ran thin. I don't think that's necessary, he said, his tone sharp. Deborah, confused by Joshua's sudden possessiveness, hesitated. It's just lunch, she reasoned. But Joshua wasn't convinced. He had never felt jealousy before, but the idea of another man pursuing Deborah made his blood boil. He realized then, he wasn't just fond of her. He was in love with her. Meanwhile, Richard, oblivious to Joshua's feelings, continued his pursuit. He sent Deborah expensive gifts, flowers, and handwritten letters, At first, she found it flattering, but soon, it became overwhelming. She wasn't interested in Richard, but his persistence was undeniable. And as Joshua watched from the sidelines, he knew he had to act before it was too late. Joshua was never the type to let emotions dictate his actions, but when it came to Deborah, all logic seemed to vanish. Seeing Richard hover around her was infuriating. He didn't understand why it affected him so much, until one evening, when he found himself waiting for her outside the office, watching as Richard escorted her to her car. The way Richard leaned in, the way he touched her arm, it was too much. Before he realized what he was doing, Joshua stormed over, his presence commanding. "That's enough, Lawson," Joshua said, his voice low but firm. Richard raised an eyebrow, amused. "I don't see why it's any of your concern, Stephen." Joshua clenched his jaw. "Deborah works for me. I won't have her distracted." Deborah looked between them, realizing what was happening. Joshua wasn't just being protective, he was being possessive. And though part of her was annoyed, another part of her felt something entirely different, warmth. Could it be that he was finally acknowledging what she had suspected all along? After Richard left, Deborah turned to Joshua, arms crossed. "You can't just decide who I talk to." Joshua exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I know," he admitted. "But I can't stand the thought of losing you." His confession caught her off guard. For the first time, Joshua Stephen wasn't just the cold businessman, he was a man terrified of losing someone he cared about. Despite Joshua's admission, doubt still lingered in Deborah's mind. Was he acting out of love, or was it just a sense of ownership? When she overheard Christabel whispering about how Joshua would never truly love a woman of her status, the insecurities that had been buried deep inside her resurfaced. Was she just a passing phase for him? Someone he felt obligated to protect because of her past? The tension between them grew, with Deborah pulling away and Joshua noticing the shift. "What's wrong?" he asked one evening as they worked late in his office. She hesitated before finally voicing her fears. "Are you only doing all this because you feel sorry for me?" Joshua stiffened, his brows furrowing. "What?" Deborah exhaled, looking away. "Everyone says it. That you're just helping me because you pity me." For the first time, Joshua felt true frustration, not at her, but at himself. Had he not made his feelings clear? Stepping forward, he cupped her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Listen to me," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "This is not pity. This is not charity. I care about you, Deborah. And I don't want you to doubt that for a second." But the question remained, could she allow herself to believe him? The air between them remained heavy for days. Deborah was still hesitant, and Joshua, never one to chase after anyone, was learning patience for the first time in his life. But he refused to let things go unresolved. So one evening, he took a step he never had before. He invited her to his private estate, away from the office, away from the distractions. They sat by the lake, the night air crisp. "I need you to understand something," Joshua began. "I've spent years pushing people away because I didn't believe in love anymore. But then you came along, and everything changed. I never wanted to care for anyone, but with you I can't help it." His words were raw, filled with a sincerity Deborah hadn't expected. Tears welled in her eyes as she finally let go of her doubts. "I was scared," she admitted. "Scared that I was just another responsibility to you." Joshua shook his head. "You're not a responsibility. You're a choice. And I choose you." At that moment, the last of her fears melted away. They weren't perfect, but they had something real. To prove his love, Joshua did something that left Deborah speechless. At a company event, in front of his employees and business associates, he publicly declared his feelings for her. "I've always lived for my work," he said, his gaze locked on Deborah. "But for the first time in my life, I've found something, or rather, someone, more important." The entire room went silent, eyes darting between them. Deborah, stunned, felt tears prick at her eyes. Never in her wildest dreams had she imagined this moment. Whispers spread, and Christabel looked on in disbelief. Meanwhile, Richard, who had been watching from a distance, realized he had lost the battle before it had even begun. After the event, Joshua pulled Deborah aside. "Did I embarrass you?" he asked, a rare smirk playing on his lips. Deborah shook her head, overwhelmed with emotion. "No," she whispered. "You made me the happiest woman in the world." Joshua had never been the type to second-guess his decisions, but when it came to Deborah, he found himself carefully planning his next move. He knew one thing for certain: he wanted her in his life forever. But for a man who had spent decades avoiding love, proposing wasn't something he took lightly. He wanted it to be perfect, something she would never forget. After weeks of preparation, he planned a private dinner at his lakeside estate, the very place where they had cleared the air about their feelings. The setting was breathtaking: twinkling fairy lights, a soft melody playing in the background, and the lake reflecting the beauty of the night sky. Deborah had no idea what was coming. She had never been the kind of woman to dream about extravagant proposals, yet when Joshua led her to the candlelit table, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. They shared a heartfelt conversation, reminiscing about how far they had come. Then, just as she was about to take another bite of dessert, Joshua stood, his usual confident demeanor faltering slightly. "Deborah, you changed my life in ways I never imagined," he began, reaching into his pocket. "I never believed in love, but with you, I do. Will you marry me?" The ring he revealed was stunning, but what captivated her most was the look in his eyes, genuine, raw, and full of love. Tears streamed down Deborah's face as she covered her mouth in shock. She had gone from being rejected at an interview to standing before a man who had everything, asking her to be his wife. She nodded fervently before managing to whisper, "Yes, Joshua." 1,000,000 times, yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and for the first time in his life, Joshua felt an unshakable sense of happiness. But they both knew this was just the beginning. The biggest battle was yet to come. The news of their engagement spread quickly, and while some people congratulated them, others were not so thrilled, especially Joshua's family. The Stephen family was one of the wealthiest and most respected in the country, and the idea of their eldest son marrying a woman of humble beginnings was met with fierce opposition. His mother, Margaret Stephen, a woman known for her sharp tongue and even sharper instincts in business, wasted no time expressing her disapproval. "Joshua, think about what you're doing," she said, her tone laced with concern. "This girl, she's not one of us. People will talk." Joshua, who had spent most of his life valuing his mother's opinion, found himself unfazed. "I don't care what people say, Mother. I love her," he stated firmly. But Margaret was not one to give up easily. She arranged a private meeting with Deborah, hoping to dissuade her. When Deborah arrived at the grand Stephen mansion, she was met with cold politeness. Margaret studied her intently before speaking. "You seem like a nice girl, Deborah. But love isn't enough in our world. Are you truly prepared for the life ahead?" Deborah, though intimidated, refused to back down. "I know I may not be from the same background as Joshua," she admitted, "but I love him, and I will stand by him no matter what." Margaret narrowed her eyes, still unconvinced. "We'll see," she said cryptically. Deborah knew then that winning over Joshua's family would be her hardest challenge yet. The days following her meeting with Margaret were some of the toughest Deborah had ever faced. The pressure was immense, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was constantly being tested. The Stephen family threw lavish events, inviting high society women in hopes that Joshua would reconsider. They subtly made it clear that Deborah didn't belong. Despite this, she refused to crumble. She remained poised, refusing to let their wealth and status intimidate her. Joshua, seeing the weight of the situation on Deborah's shoulders, did everything he could to reassure her. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," he told her one evening as they sat on his balcony overlooking the city. "I chose you, and that's all that matters." But Deborah knew it wasn't that simple. If she was going to be his wife, she needed to show the world, and his family, that she wasn't just a woman from a poor background. She was strong, capable, and worthy. At a charity event hosted by the Stephen family, Deborah had the perfect opportunity to prove herself. When one of the event organizers collapsed unexpectedly, panic spread through the room. But Deborah didn't hesitate. She stepped in, taking charge, organizing the guests, and ensuring everything continued smoothly. By the end of the night, even Margaret Stephen had to admit, Deborah was no ordinary woman. Margaret Stephen had spent weeks resisting the idea of Deborah as her future daughter-in-law, but the young woman's resilience was undeniable. Every challenge thrown her way, she met with grace. Every whisper of doubt, she silenced with quiet strength. Even Joshua's father, who had remained largely neutral, finally admitted, "The girl has spirit. Maybe she's exactly what Joshua needs." But Margaret wasn't fully convinced, until an unexpected moment changed everything. One evening, Margaret found herself alone with Deborah, and curiosity got the better of her. "Tell me, Deborah, why do you love my son?" she asked. Most women would have given a rehearsed, sugar-coated answer, but Deborah simply smiled. "Because he's more than just a CEO. He's kind, even when he doesn't show it. He protects those he loves. And he makes me feel like I belong." Her honesty took Margaret by surprise. For the first time, she saw what Joshua saw, someone who wasn't after money or status, but love. Later that week, Joshua received a call from his mother. "I still have my reservations," she admitted. "But if she's who you want, then I won't stand in your way." Joshua smirked. "Mother, you'll love her in time. Just wait and see." Not everyone was happy about Joshua and Deborah's impending wedding. Christabel, Joshua's longtime secretary, had spent years silently hoping that one day, he would notice her. She had been by his side through everything, believing that if she stayed loyal long enough, he would see her as more than just an employee. But now, all her efforts seemed wasted on a woman who had walked into his life by accident. Desperate, Christabel made one final move. She arranged a meeting with Deborah under the guise of offering help with wedding preparations. "Deborah, I just want to warn you," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Joshua may care about you now, but do you really think a man like him will stay committed? He's never needed love before. What makes you so special?" But Deborah wasn't easily shaken anymore. She met Christabel's gaze head-on. "Joshua loves me," she said firmly. "And no matter what you say, you can't change that." Christabel's face twisted in frustration. She had lost. With nothing left to do, she resigned herself to the inevitable. Joshua and Deborah were unstoppable, and soon, nothing would stand in the way of their love. The tension between Joshua and Deborah had been brewing for days, and it all came to a breaking point when Christabel made her final move. Knowing she was losing her influence over Joshua, Christabel leaked fabricated emails to the press, suggesting that Deborah had been after Joshua's wealth all along. The media exploded with the scandal, twisting the story into a tale of a poor girl seducing a billionaire for financial gain. When Joshua saw the headlines, doubt crept into his mind for the first time. Had Deborah truly loved him for who he was, or had she seen him as a golden opportunity? Unable to confront her immediately, Joshua distanced himself, leaving Deborah confused and hurt. Deborah, heartbroken by Joshua's sudden withdrawal, tried to reach out to him, but he barely responded. She had no idea what was going on until she saw the news for herself. Shocked and devastated, she immediately sought Joshua out, demanding to know if he really believed those lies. Joshua, torn between his emotions and the weight of the accusations, lashed out in frustration. "I don't know what to believe anymore," he admitted, his voice laced with anger and pain. That single statement shattered Deborah's heart. She had fought so hard to prove herself, and now, the man she loved doubted her sincerity. Unable to bear the betrayal, she made a heartbreaking decision. "If you don't trust me, then there's no point in us being together," she whispered, turning away. As Deborah packed her things, tears streaming down her face, Joshua watched in silence, his heart aching. The moment the door closed behind her, he felt an emptiness he had never known before. The house, once filled with her warmth, felt cold and lifeless. Christabel, thinking she had won, approached him with feigned concern, but Joshua saw through her act. In that instant, he realized his mistake. He had let the doubts of the world taint his love. Rushing to his car, he sped off, determined to fix the damage before it was too late. Joshua drove recklessly through the city, searching for Deborah. He called her repeatedly, but she refused to answer. She was walking aimlessly, her mind filled with memories of everything they had shared. She had loved him with all her heart, and now, it felt like he had thrown it all away. Just as she was about to board a bus back to her mother's house, a car screeched to a halt beside her. Joshua jumped out, breathless and desperate. "Deborah, please don't go," he pleaded, his voice raw with emotion. Deborah turned to him, her face streaked with tears. "Why should I stay, Joshua? You doubted me when I needed you the most." Joshua stepped closer, reaching for her hands. "I was a fool," he admitted. "I let my insecurities and the lies of others cloud my judgment. But you are the best thing that has ever happened to me, and I cannot lose you." His sincerity broke through her defenses, but the pain was still there. "How do I know this won't happen again?" she whispered. Joshua dropped to his knees right there on the busy street. "Because I love you," he said, his voice unwavering. "And I will spend the rest of my life proving it to you." Tears welled in Deborah's eyes as she looked at the man before her. He had always been powerful, untouchable, and yet here he was, vulnerable for her. The love in his eyes was undeniable. Slowly, she nodded. "I love you too, Joshua," she whispered. The crowd that had gathered around them erupted in applause as Joshua pulled her into his arms, sealing their love with a deep, passionate kiss. With their love reaffirmed, Joshua wasted no time in making his intentions clear. He wanted to marry Deborah as soon as possible. He spared no expense, hiring the best wedding planners, designers, and venues. Deborah, still overwhelmed by everything, watched as her simple life transformed into a fairy tale. Joshua wanted to give her the world, but she remained grounded, ensuring that their wedding reflected their love and not just his wealth. Meanwhile, the media had a field day with their upcoming nuptials. Some praised their love story, calling it a modern-day Cinderella tale, while others still doubted Deborah's intentions. But she no longer cared about public opinion. The only thing that mattered was the love she shared with Joshua. As she tried on her wedding dress, she found herself in tears. Never in her wildest dreams had she imagined that the girl who was once struggling to afford a meal would now be marrying a billionaire. Joshua, on the other hand, was determined to make their wedding unforgettable. He personally oversaw every detail, ensuring that everything was perfect. His family, though initially resistant, began to accept Deborah as they saw how much she meant to him. The countdown to their big day had begun, and nothing would stand in their way. As the wedding day drew closer, Deborah found herself battling waves of doubt. Not about her love for Joshua, but about whether she truly belonged in his world. Every magazine, every news outlet scrutinized her past, highlighting the vast difference between her and Joshua. She overheard whispers from high society women who questioned if she was worthy of being his wife. The pressure was suffocating, and for the first time, she feared she might not be enough for him. Joshua, ever perceptive, noticed her distant stares and worried frowns. One evening, he took her to the rooftop of their home, where they could see the entire city beneath them. "Deborah, do you love me?" he asked, holding her hands firmly. "Of course, I do," she whispered. "Then nothing else matters," he said, his voice filled with certainty. "I chose you, not because of your background, but because of who you are. You are my strength, my heart, and my future." His words melted her fears, and as he held her close, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Despite her lingering nerves, Deborah pushed forward. She would not allow the doubts of others to dictate her happiness. With Joshua by her side, she was ready to step into the next chapter of their lives, proving that love was stronger than any social divide. Just when everything seemed perfect, a sudden crisis shook their world. Joshua's company was hit with a financial scandal, and rumors swirled that Deborah's presence had brought bad luck. Investors hesitated, and his board members suggested postponing the wedding until the storm passed. The pressure was immense, and the weight of responsibility fell heavily on Joshua's shoulders. Deborah, determined not to be a burden, considered stepping back to ease his troubles. "Maybe we should delay the wedding," she suggested hesitantly. Joshua turned to her with fierce determination. "No, Deborah. You are not the problem. You are my peace," he said, cupping her face. "I won't let anything or anyone make me doubt what we have." His unwavering support reassured her, and together, they faced the storm head-on. Joshua worked tirelessly to clear his name, and Deborah stood by him every step of the way. She refused to be hidden, walking into public events with her head held high. Her quiet strength and loyalty won over even his harshest critics. When the truth was finally revealed, Joshua's reputation was restored, and his love for Deborah had only deepened. They had been tested, but their love had emerged stronger than ever. With the scandal behind them, Joshua and Deborah focused on moving forward. His family, once skeptical, had witnessed how she stood by him through the toughest moments. His mother, who had been the most resistant, finally pulled Deborah aside one evening. "You have proven yourself," she admitted, taking Deborah's hands. "You are more than enough for my son." The words filled Deborah with warmth, and for the first time, she felt fully accepted. The wedding preparations resumed with even greater enthusiasm. Every detail was meticulously planned, from the flowers to the music. Joshua wanted the day to be a reflection of their journey, a celebration of love that had defied all odds. Invitations were sent out, and the world eagerly anticipated the grand event. Through it all, Deborah remained grounded. She had fought hard for her happiness, and now, she was ready to embrace it fully. The love between her and Joshua was unshakable, a testament to their resilience and devotion. They had conquered every obstacle, and now, nothing stood in the way of their forever. The day had finally arrived. The sun shone brightly as guests filled the grand venue, eager to witness the union of Joshua and Deborah. Lavish floral arrangements adorned every corner, and soft music played in the background. The air was thick with excitement and emotion. Joshua stood at the altar, his heart pounding as he awaited his bride. When Deborah appeared, dressed in a breathtaking white gown, the entire room fell silent. She was stunning, radiating grace and beauty. But for Joshua, it wasn't just her appearance, it was the journey they had taken together that made this moment so powerful. As she walked down the aisle, their eyes locked, and in that instant, nothing else mattered. Their vows were heartfelt, a promise of forever that brought tears to many eyes. "You were the unexpected blessing that changed my life," Joshua whispered. "And I will cherish you for all my days." Deborah, voice trembling with emotion, responded, "You saw me when the world overlooked me. You are my love, my home, my everything." As they sealed their vows with a passionate kiss, the crowd erupted in cheers. They had finally become husband and wife. Marriage was a new adventure, and while it wasn't always perfect, Joshua and Deborah faced it together. Adjusting to life as husband and wife came with challenges, from balancing their personal and professional lives to dealing with the constant attention of the media. But through it all, they remained a team. Joshua, once emotionally guarded, became more open with his affections. He took pride in introducing Deborah as his wife, making it clear that she was not just part of his life, she was the heart of it. Deborah, on the other hand, embraced her new role with grace, using her platform to inspire others. She launched charities focused on helping women find employment, determined to give back in any way she could. Their love only deepened with time. Every moment, every challenge, every triumph was a testament to the strength of their bond. The world may have doubted them, but they had built something unbreakable. They had proven that true love wasn't about status or wealth, it was about choosing each other, time and time again. Just when life seemed settled, fate had one more surprise in store. Deborah started feeling unwell, and at first, she dismissed it as stress. But when the symptoms persisted, Joshua insisted she see a doctor. Nothing could have prepared them for the news they received: Deborah was pregnant. The revelation filled Joshua with overwhelming joy. "We're going to be parents," he whispered in awe, pulling her into his arms. Deborah, tears of happiness streaming down her face, laughed. "Can you believe it?" she said, resting her hand on her stomach. Their love had already changed their lives, but now, it was creating new life. The excitement spread through their families and friends, and the entire world celebrated with them. It was the beginning of yet another chapter, one filled with even more love, growth, and endless possibilities. Years passed, and their love only grew stronger. Joshua and Deborah built a beautiful family, raising their child with the same values that had brought them together: kindness, perseverance, and unconditional love. Their love story, once met with doubt and criticism, became an inspiration to many. Looking back, Deborah couldn't believe how far she had come. From a struggling woman trying to find her place in the world to the wife of the man she loved, a successful entrepreneur, and now a mother. She had faced heartbreak, betrayal, and countless obstacles, but love had always guided her through. As she sat on the balcony, watching the sunset with Joshua by her side and their child playing in the yard, she knew she had everything she had ever dreamed of. "I wouldn't change a thing," she whispered. Joshua took her hand, kissing it softly. "Neither would I," he replied. Their love had indeed changed everything, proving that sometimes, the most beautiful stories come from the most unexpected beginnings. That's the end of the story. What did you learn about the story? Please leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more interesting stories. Thanks for watching.